Robert Maudsley. In the basement of a prison in West Yorkshire, the British government built a cell that exists nowhere else in the country. 2 inches of bulletproof acrylic across one wall, furniture made of compressed cardboard, a concrete slab for a bed, and fixtures bolted down so they cannot be lifted. It was built for one man in 1983, and he was held under that regime for more than 4 decades. He has spent 23 of every 24 hours behind that panel, for longer than any prisoner in British history. Robert John Maudsley was born on the 26th of June, 1953, in Liverpool. His childhood ran through care homes, and by every psychiatric account taken since, sustained abuse once he was returned to his family. By his early 20s, he was in London, addicted to drugs, supporting himself through sex work, and reporting auditory hallucinations that told him to kill his parents. He later said that if he had killed his parents in 1970, none of the people who died afterward would have died at all. On the 14th of March, 1974, at the age of 21, Maudsley took the life of a man named John Farrell in Wood Green, London. According to the account he gave afterward, Farrell had shown him photographs of children he had abused. Maudsley turned himself in. He was found unfit to stand trial and committed to Broadmoor Hospital. That should have been the end of it. In 1977, working with another patient named David Cheeseman, Maudsley barricaded himself into a room with a third patient, David Francis, who had been convicted of offenses against children. They held the door for roughly 9 hours. When staff finally got in, Francis had been harmed fatally. The mythology started there. A false report circulated that Maudsley had eaten part of the victim's brain, and the tabloids gave him a nickname that has followed him for half a century. The claim was later debunked. There was never forensic support for it. The nickname stuck anyway, which is worth saying plainly, because almost everything the public thinks it knows about this man traces back to a story that did not happen. Convicted of manslaughter, he was moved out of the hospital system and into Wakefield Prison. He was there less than a year. On the 25th of July, 1978, Maudsley ended 2 lives in a single day. He invited an inmate named Salney Darwood, who was serving time for the death of his wife, into his cell for a game of chess. Afterward, he went looking for a second man and found William Roberts, who was imprisoned for an offense against a child. By later accounts, Maudsley had set out to reach as many as 7. He stopped at 2, walked to the wing office, and told the officer on duty that the next roll call would come up short. So what does a prison system do with a man who has ended 4 lives? 3 of them inside institutions built to prevent exactly that. He was convicted and given a whole-life tariff, which in England means no minimum term, no parole board, and no mechanism by which he can ever be released. 5 years later, the Home Office authorized the cell in the Wakefield basement, and he was moved into it. Meals through a hatch. Movement only under escort by multiple officers. Maudsley wrote that the solution had been to put him into solitary confinement and throw away the key, to bury him alive in a concrete coffin. His nephew Gavin has told reporters something stranger and harder to sit with, which is that his uncle is happy and content in isolation, and that he would take a life again if he were ever let out. In 2000, Maudsley wrote a letter that was published in the national press, asking for something to fill the hours. He wanted a pet budgerigar, or a set of paints, or a terminal. If none of that could be permitted, he wrote, then the state should supply him with a cyanide capsule so he could end his own life himself. He was being held in a way no other prisoner in the country was being held, with no prospect of that changing. And he wanted either something to do or a way out. Neither was granted. Whole-life tariffs have been challenged repeatedly on human rights grounds, and none of that litigation has altered his position. He remains one of a small group of prisoners in England and Wales who will die in custody by operation of the sentence itself, and the only one held this long in a cell purpose-built for a single individual. In March 2025, Maudsley went on hunger strike after staff confiscated his games console, his books, and his music. The following month, reporting indicated he had been moved out of Wakefield entirely and transferred to Whitemoor Prison in Cambridgeshire, onto a wing for prisoners with personality disorders. The prison service confirmed the transfer but declined to give reasons for it. The unit he was placed on is a therapeutic wing, which in theory offers more psychological support than 4 decades of isolation ever did. In practice, it moved him roughly 125 miles from the family members and solicitors who had been visiting him at Wakefield, and reporting in 2026 indicates he has not received a visitor in more than a year since arriving. As of 2026, Robert Maudsley is 73 years old. He remains under a whole-life tariff, and he has now spent more than 4 decades in near-total isolation, every day of it the result of a decision made after the harm was already done. Britain built its cage around a man it already understood. California made the opposite error, and it made it in a single night. Jaime Osuna. On the morning of the 9th of March, 2019, officers at Corcoran State Prison in California opened a cell and found only one of the 2 men inside still alive. The other had been in that cell for roughly 24 hours. What prosecutors say happened in those hours has kept the case out of trial for more than 6 years. Jaime Osuna grew up in Bakersfield. By his 20s, his face and scalp were almost entirely covered in ink, including a grin tattooed across his mouth and a pentagram on his forehead, and he had given himself a nickname that translated roughly to the man with 1,000 faces. He told a reporter that he had begun harming animals around the age of 8 or 9, and claimed he had begun harming people as a young teenager. On the 13th of November, 2011, Osuna took the life of Yvette Pena at the El Morocco Motel in Bakersfield. She was 37 years old and the mother of 6 children. The coroner attributed her death to a combination of blunt force, sharp force, and asphyxia. In 2017, Osuna pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and related counts in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table, and received life without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, he smirked, mocked her family from the defense table, and gave them a thumbs up. 2 years later, he was celled at Corcoran with Luis Romero, who was 44. Romero had been in custody since 1992 on a second-degree murder conviction out of Los Angeles County, and unlike the man he was sharing a cell with, he was serving a sentence that carried the possibility of parole. He had been in that cell for roughly 24 hours. His family were told only that he had died, and that a homicide investigation was open, and they buried him without knowing what had happened, in a closed casket his mother had requested for reasons of her own. They learned the rest from local news coverage. Prosecutors alleged that Osuna decapitated and mutilated him over a period of hours, and that words were written on the cell wall in blood. Kings County Assistant District Attorney Phil Esbenshad told the Associated Press that in terms of sheer heinousness, it was the most gruesome case he had seen, and that prosecutors believed the victim was conscious for at least part of it. Staff found the scene only after ordering Osuna to take down a sheet he had hung across the cell window. A review by the state's Office of the Inspector General found that officers conducting rounds that night had reported both men in the cell as alive. That finding is the part corrections officials have never satisfactorily explained. Rounds are the basic unit of prison safety. An officer walks the tier, confirms the people inside each cell are alive and accounted for, and logs it. On that night, The log recorded a functioning institution while a man died inside it. The housing decision was equally hard to defend. Osuna had pleaded guilty to a killing that the state had originally treated as death penalty eligible. He had told a journalist on camera about harming animals as a child and had behaved at his own sentencing in a way that left no ambiguity about remorse. All of that was in a file, and he was still assigned a cellmate in a segregation unit, which is the part of a prison specifically designed for people who cannot safely be around others. How does a state classify a man at its highest risk level, document what he is, and then give him a cellmate? Kings County charged Osuna with murder, later amended to add aggravated mayhem and a series of enhancements, and the case has barely moved since. Criminal proceedings were suspended entirely after a judge found him incompetent to stand trial on the testimony of 2 psychiatrists, and he was transferred to a psychiatric inpatient program. Clinicians reported him restored to competency in May 2021. It took until September 2022 for a judge to formally rule him competent and reinstate the case. He then fired his attorneys and refused to sit for psychiatric interviews. The death penalty remains legally available. 6 years on, no preliminary hearing had been held, let alone a trial date set, and Osuna stands accused rather than convicted of Romero's death. Romero's mother, Dora Solares, took the state to federal court. Her claim rests on a simple point, which is that officials knew exactly what Osuna was and made a housing decision anyway. The complaint alleges the prison bypassed a protocol requiring a committee to review 2 inmates before they are celled together, and that required safety checks were not carried out. It also alleges that a sergeant and other officers photographed her son's remains and posted the images online. In March 2024, the United States District Court for the Eastern District of California largely refused to throw the case out. Every year the case sits unresolved is a year in which Romero's family has no verdict and no formal account of what happened in that cell. There is also a practical problem in prosecuting a man already serving life without parole, because the only sentence that would change anything is death, and California is not currently carrying out executions. The state is litigating toward an outcome that will likely leave him exactly where he already is. As of 2026, Jaime Osuna remains in California custody, serving the sentence he received in 2017. After the Corcoran killing, he was moved into a psychiatric prison setting and held in isolation. The case that would determine what happens next is still sitting on a docket in Kings County. Osuna never asked to be housed with anyone. In Florida, a man did the opposite, and he said it out loud in a courtroom. James Robertson. There is a category of case that unsettles the judges who handle it, and this is one of them. A Florida inmate was charged with second-degree murder, which carries no death sentence, and stood up at his first appearance to insist the state had it wrong. He told the court it had been premeditated. He wanted the charge upgraded because he wanted to be executed. James Robertson was born on the 7th of March, 1962, and by the time he reached his mid-40s, he had spent nearly 3 decades in Florida custody. His record ran through burglary and battery, and in 1997, he was convicted of attempting to take the life of a cellmate. Most of those years were served in close management, the Florida Department of Corrections term for long-term restrictive housing. Isolation was not something the system did to him occasionally. It was the environment he had lived in for most of his adult life. In December 2008, at Charlotte Correctional Institution, he was sharing a cell with Frank Hart. Hart was 52 years old. He stood 5'6" and weighed 133 pounds. He had no history of conflict with Robertson before the cell assignment was made. Robertson used a garrote fashioned from socks tied together, and Hart screamed for help while it happened. Robertson never contested any of it. He told investigators he had done it to get onto death row and out of close management, and that he had believed Hart was a sex offender. He was not describing a fight that got out of hand. He was describing a plan. To understand the calculation, it helps to know what close management actually is. In Florida, it means a single cell, very limited property, restricted movement under escort, minimal contact, and a review process that can extend the placement indefinitely. Robertson had spent something close to a career in it. Death row carried different privileges, a different routine, and a defined status rather than an open-ended classification decision made by staff. He had run the numbers and concluded that the fastest route to a better cell ran through a capital charge, and the only currency he had was another man's life. The initial charging decision nearly derailed the plan. Prosecutors filed second-degree murder, which in Florida is not a capital offense, and that would have left Robertson exactly where he was, with more years added to a sentence that already had no end. So he corrected them in open court at his first appearance in June 2009 and told the judge that what he had done was premeditated. He was, in effect, arguing the state's case against himself and arguing it harder than the state initially had. What is a court supposed to do when the sentence it is being asked to impose is exactly what the defendant is asking for? Robertson pleaded guilty on the 4th of October. He waived his right to a penalty-phase jury and instructed his attorneys to present no mitigation at all. A psychiatrist who examined him concluded that what he had done was consistent with his personality structure, rather than the product of a major mental illness, which removed the last available argument against holding him fully responsible. On the 18th of December, 2012, he was sentenced to death. He did not stop while the case was pending. In 2011, he stabbed a corrections officer and tried to take the officer's keys so he could reach another inmate. He warned that he would keep going unless the state sent him to death row. The 2011 attack on the corrections officer is the detail that makes the rest of the case legible. Robertson was already charged capitally at that point. He had already achieved, on paper, the thing he said he wanted. And he still went after a member of staff, and still went for the keys, and still told anyone listening that he would continue until he was moved. Whatever label a psychiatrist puts on that, it removes the ordinary tools an institution has. Threats of additional time mean nothing to a man serving life. Threats of isolation mean nothing to a man who has lived in it for decades. Threats of death are, in his case, an incentive. Since arriving there, he has repeatedly tried to abandon his appeals and move his execution forward. Florida requires review of capital sentences whether or not the condemned man wants it, so the litigation has continued around him, largely without his cooperation. By multiple accounts, he prefers death row to close management because the conditions there are less restrictive than the ones he spent decades in. As of 2026, James Robertson remains on Florida's death row at Rayford. No execution date has been set. He has now been continuously incarcerated for close to 5 decades, which is longer than most of the officers guarding him have been alive. Robertson's reach began and ended inside whatever cell he occupied. The man in Colorado had no such limitation. Barry Mills. The federal government kept a man in a concrete cell at ADX Florence in Colorado for the last stretch of his life, and it barely mattered. From inside the most secure prison the United States operates, he could still get people harmed in penitentiaries 1,000 miles away. The FBI has called the organization he helped run the most dangerous prison gang in the country. Barry Byron Mills was born on the 7th of July, 1948, in Windsor, California. He was first locked up in 1967, and after an armed robbery conviction in 1969, he entered the California prison system and never left it. At San Quentin, he joined the Aryan Brotherhood, which had been founded inside that same prison in 1964, and over the following decade he rose to its three-man federal commission. Inside the organization, he was known as the Baron. On the 20th of May, 1979, at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Mills nearly decapitated an inmate named John Sherman Marsloff in a recreation yard toilet stall, inflicting 16 stab wounds. The killing was reportedly carried out on contract, ordered by another Brotherhood figure over a drug deal that had gone wrong. Whatever else it was, it functioned as a credential. With Tyler Bingham, known inside as the Hulk, Mills pushed the Brotherhood into narcotics and racketeering across the entire federal system. Orders traveled by paper, hidden inside correspondence that looked ordinary to anyone screening it. A man in permanent lockdown could name a target in one state and have the instruction carried out in another within weeks. In 1997, the commission ordered what prosecutors later described as a race war against a rival organization known as the DC Blacks. 2 black inmates were stabbed to death at the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. How do you prosecute an organization whose leadership is already serving life in the most secure facility the country has? The Department of Justice answered that in 2002 with a 140-page indictment naming 40 defendants and charging the Aryan Brotherhood as a racketeering enterprise. The case that reached trial in Santa Ana, California in 2006 involved 17 killings or attempted killings dating back to 1979. Mills's own attorney, Dean Stewart, told the Associated Press that he was looking at a list of charges unlike anything he was aware of in any other case. Bringing that case to trial was itself an undertaking. The Brotherhood operates on a rule that members describe as blood in, blood out, meaning entry is earned through violence, and there is no recognized way to leave except by dying, and that rule makes cooperating witnesses extraordinarily difficult to protect. Several of the men who testified had sat in the rooms where decisions were made. The security around the proceedings was unlike anything a federal courthouse in Southern California normally handles, and the government's theory required jurors to accept that a handful of men locked in permanent isolation had functioned as an executive body issuing instructions to a nationwide membership. Mills was convicted of murder in aid of racketeering, conspiracy, and related counts, and received 4 consecutive life terms. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. The jury deadlocked in the penalty phase, and that deadlock is the only reason he was not executed. He was sent to ADX Florence, where he was held in a single cell under communication restrictions. ADX Florence is the end of the federal line. Inmates are held in single cells for almost the entire day, with poured concrete furniture, a narrow window angled so that only sky is visible, and communication restrictions imposed by the Attorney General directly. It was built in 1994 in large part because of men like Mills, after killings inside other federal penitentiaries showed that existing high-security facilities could not contain organized violence. He spent his final years in the institution his own career had helped justify. Barry Mills was found dead in that cell on Sunday, the 8th of July, 2018, one day after his 70th birthday. Fremont County Coroner Randy Keller said the death appeared to be from natural causes and was not being treated as suspicious. The 4 consecutive life terms were, in practical terms, symbolic. He was already never leaving custody. What the convictions did accomplish was to establish in a federal record, admissible and citable, that the Aryan Brotherhood was a criminal enterprise with a command structure which changed how every subsequent case against its members could be charged. As of 2026, the organization Mills helped build is still active and still the subject of federal prosecution. He had been in custody for more than 5 decades when he died. People who studied him described a man who was highly intelligent, personally charismatic, and reportedly fond of Machiavelli, and none of that is a compliment in this context. It is an explanation of how one man in a locked room directed violence across an entire country. Mills's power came from what nobody could see. The next case is the opposite, because a camera recorded every second of it. Troy Kell. Most violence inside prisons has to be reconstructed afterward from statements, injuries, and inference, because witnesses will not talk and the scene is contaminated within minutes. This one required none of that. Prison security cameras recorded the entire attack, and the resulting trial had to be held inside the prison itself for security reasons. Troy Michael Kell was born on the 13th of June, 1968. He committed his first killing at 18. In 1986, in Nevada, he took the life of 21-year-old James Kelly, who went by the nickname Cotton and whose legal name was James Theed. By the accounts given at the time, a teenage friend of Kell's had asked him to confront Kelly over stalking her. Kell received life without parole in Nevada and was later transferred into the Utah system under an interstate compact. By then, he was a committed white supremacist. Nevada had sentenced him to life without parole, the most that state could impose short of death, and he was moved across state lines under a compact arrangement of the kind corrections systems use to manage overcrowding and problem inmates. Nothing about that transfer altered his sentence. It relocated the problem and placed a man with a documented racial ideology into a facility where he would live among a mixed population. Lonnie Blackman was 32 years old. He was a black inmate at the Central Utah Correctional Facility in Gunnison, serving time for robbery and theft. On the 6th of July, 1994, he was moving through the facility when Kell and another inmate, Eric Daniels, reached him. Kell had a smuggled handcuff key and used it to free himself during an escort. Daniels held Blackman down. Kell inflicted 67 wounds over roughly 3 minutes. Prosecutor Sandra Brunker told the court that 9 of those wounds were to the eyes and argued that this was deliberate, done to ensure the victim experienced as much pain as possible. Court records logged 26 wounds to the face and 27 to the neck. When officers reached him afterward, Kell shouted a white power slogan at them. 67. That is not an estimate. It is the count from the autopsy. What defense remains available when the jury can simply be shown the recording? Kell was tried inside the prison and convicted of aggravated murder. On the 8th of August, 1996, he was sentenced to death, and he initially elected the firing squad as his method. Prosecutors argued a racial motive throughout. Brunker also put before the court the testimony of a corrections officer Kell had threatened, who described Kell saying he had nothing to lose by acting out, because he was already serving life in Nevada. That is the sentence that explains the whole case. He had already been given the maximum, so the system had nothing left to take. Eric Daniels received a life sentence. The killing later became the subject of an HBO documentary about the anatomy of a prison murder, which is how the case reached any audience outside Utah at all. The detail that most often gets lost is the handcuff key. Kell was under escort, which means he was restrained and under staff control when the attack began. A smuggled key turned a controlled movement into an unsupervised one, inside a facility whose entire security model assumes that restraints hold. That is why the trial was held on prison grounds rather than in a county courthouse. Utah is also one of very few states that still authorizes death by firing squad, and prisoners sentenced under the older statutory scheme were permitted to elect it. Kell made that election at the outset. In 1999, Utah scheduled back-to-back firing squad executions for Kell and another condemned prisoner on consecutive nights in late June. Kell filed an appeal days beforehand. The execution did not happen, and no date has been set in the 27 years since. The appellate history has now run for 3 decades. He filed his first petition for post-conviction relief in 2003, arguing that his trial lawyers had failed to investigate and present evidence about his psychiatric history and his childhood. Utah's courts rejected most of it as procedurally barred. A second petition alleged juror misconduct at sentencing, built on interviews given in 2012, in which 3 jurors described communications with the trial judge outside open court. In December 2023, the Utah Supreme Court denied him for the 4th time. A federal appeal was dismissed by the 10th Circuit because he had not exhausted his state remedies, which meant the court never reached the question his lawyers wanted answered, which was how long all of this is permitted to take. Kell's appeals have been denied repeatedly, and he was one of 5 condemned Utah prisoners who sued the state in 2023 over its execution methods and protocols. A 3rd district judge dismissed that suit in December of the same year, ruling the claims untimely because the protocols they challenged had last been amended in 2010, and rejecting the argument that either method amounts to cruel and unusual punishment. Prosecutors have said that after the killing, he continued making a name for himself inside by attacking inmates of other races. Utah has carried out very few executions in the modern era, and the gap between a death sentence and its enforcement in that state is measured in decades rather than years. Kell has now been under sentence of death for longer than Lonnie Blackman was alive. As of October 2025, no execution date had been set. As of 2026, Troy Kell is 58 years old and still on Utah's death row, 30 years after a camera recorded what he did in a prison corridor. Kell chose his method, but never asked for the sentence. In Florida, a man did both. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Wayne Doty. Florida law lets a condemned prisoner choose the electric chair instead of lethal injection. The chair has sat unused since the late 1990s, when a badly handled execution pushed the state to switch methods. Exactly 1 man currently on Florida's death row has asked for it, and he has spent more than a decade trying to get the state to move faster. Wayne Charles Doty was born on the 12th of April 1973 in Pueblo, Colorado, and grew up to be a Plant City, Florida man with a drug problem and a short fuse. Harvey Horn II worked as a night watchman at a manufacturing plant in Plant City. On the 20th of April, 1996, Doty shot him 5 times in the face during a robbery driven by drugs. Horn left behind a son who has spent nearly 30 years speaking publicly about the case, and who still does. Doty was convicted in 1997 and sentenced to life. He served that sentence at Florida State Prison, and on the 17th of May, 2011, he strangled and stabbed his cellmate. Xavier Rodriguez was 21 years old. The dispute, by Doty's own account, was about disrespect and stolen tobacco. Rodriguez was 2 years old when Doty first went to prison. He had been alive for less time than Doty had been incarcerated, and he was in the same institution as one of the most closely watched inmates in the Florida system. The dispute that ended his life would not have registered anywhere else in the world. Inside a maximum security prison, tobacco functions as currency, and a debt or a theft becomes a question of standing rather than value. What separated this from an impulsive prison killing was the paperwork behind it. According to the Florida Supreme Court's opinion in the case, 2 prison employees testified that Doty had confessed to them that he had been planning Rodriguez's death for weeks. The state argued that this made the killing cold, calculated, and premeditated, which under Florida law is one of the aggravating factors that opens the door to a death sentence. What leverage does a prison system have left over a man already serving life who has decided he wants to die? Doty pleaded guilty and represented himself. At the 2013 proceeding, he did not ask for mercy and did not allow anyone else to ask on his behalf. He told the court he was not going to stop and that he would do it again if he had to. He went further and made clear he was willing to include staff, saying he did not want to be in a position where someone might not make it home to their family. He was first sentenced to death on the 5th of June, 2013, and the Florida Supreme Court upheld it the following month. A second prisoner, William Edward Wells, was convicted as an accomplice in Rodriguez's death and received life without parole. Wells was later sentenced to death himself for killing another prisoner in 2019. Representing yourself in a capital case is close to the worst decision a defendant can make. Doty was not confused about the consequences. He wanted no mitigation presented, because mitigation is the mechanism by which a court is persuaded to return life instead of death. And life was the outcome he was trying to avoid. He had already been living that sentence for 15 years. Then he began pushing for the sentence to be carried out. In a handwritten affidavit, he asked to be executed in the electric chair, writing that it would bring peace to the victim's family as well as his own spiritual freedom, and citing the ongoing controversy over lethal injection as part of his reasoning. He has also said, more simply, that he does not like needles. He remains the only person on Florida's death row to have made that election. The mechanism is narrow. Under Florida law, lethal injection is the default, and a condemned prisoner who wants the chair has to say so in writing, delivered to the warden, within 30 days of the mandate issuing after the state Supreme Court affirms the sentence. Doty filed his request with the Circuit Court in Bradford County and waived his appeals in the same document. Not everyone accepted his framing. Doty has claimed at times that he ended Rodriguez's life for the sake of the Horn family, as a way of giving them the closure of seeing him executed. Harvey Horn's son has responded to that with open fury, pointing out that Doty did not want to die back when he was fighting the charge for his father's death. He fought that one. Doty appeared in the 10th episode of a Netflix documentary series about people who have taken a life, which put his request in front of a much larger audience than the Florida court system ever would have. On the 16th of January, 2025, the Florida Supreme Court dismissed his appeal. He asked to be executed in 2013. 13 years later, the request is still working its way through a review system built specifically to slow it down. As of 2026, Wayne Doty is 53 years old and held on death row at Union Correctional Institution. No execution date has been set. The chair he has asked for has not been used in this century. Doty is still waiting. In South Carolina, a man made the same request and the state granted it. Jeffrey Motz. South Carolina carried out an execution in May 2011 and then did not carry out another one for 13 years. The man who ended that run had asked for it. He wrote to the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court to say the jury had been right, the judge had been right, and he agreed with both of them. Jeffrey Brian Motz was born on the 5th of May, 1975. On the 3rd of April, 1995, at 19 years old, he went to a house in Pacolet, South Carolina, looking for money to buy crack cocaine. Etta Osteen was 73 years old, and she was Motz's own great-aunt. Clyde Camby was 79 and was her brother-in-law. Motz bound Camby and shot him in the cheek, then shot Osteen in the back as she tried to get away. They were family, and the total he took from the house was not worth anything close to what he did to get it. He was convicted in 1997 and received 2 life sentences. 10 years later, he was at Perry Correctional Institution in Greenville County, sharing a cell with Charles Martin, who went by Chuck and was 26 years old. There had been trouble between them already, over a stolen radio and over a weapon found in another inmate's cell, and both men had reason to be kept apart. On the 5th of December, 2005, Motz confronted Martin over a lie Martin had told another inmate about him. He knocked Martin unconscious, bound him with strips torn from bedsheets, and then held him for about 5 minutes, while Martin begged him to stop. Afterward, Motz ate breakfast. He smoked a cigarette. He dragged the body out to the common area. The inmates called the rock, kicked it in front of the other men, and said, "This is what happens to informers." Then he reported the killing himself. The body was found on the 8th of December. During his confession, he asked investigators to pass a message to prosecutors, which was that he was already serving 2 life sentences, and a 3rd one was not going to make any difference to him. How do you deter a man who has already been told he will die exactly where he is standing? The state charged him capitally, using his prior murder convictions as the aggravating circumstance. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 2007, and he made it clear to his own attorneys from early on that he did not want the jury coming back with life. He told them he only went through the trial at all so his parents would not think he had given up. Then he moved to shut the process down. He wrote to Chief Justice Jean Toll saying he was guilty of a horrible crime, that the jury had thought he deserved death and the judge had agreed, and that he agreed as well and was ready to accept his punishment. The South Carolina Supreme Court sent the case back for a competency hearing before it would let him waive anything. Examiners went through his medical records dating to childhood, his trial transcripts, his employment history, and his corrections file, and interviewed him, his mother, and a prison minister who had visited him. They concluded he was competent. The court agreed the waiver was knowing and voluntary, and found the sentence neither excessive nor disproportionate. Competency in this context does not mean sanity in the ordinary sense, and it does not mean the decision was a reasonable one. The legal question is narrower. It asks whether the prisoner understands that he is going to be put to death, understands why, and is capable of making the choice to stop fighting it without being driven by a mental illness that distorts his reasoning. Courts take that question seriously precisely because the person asking to die has an obvious interest that runs against his own survival, and because a state that grants such a request without scrutiny is arguably assisting a suicide rather than carrying out a sentence. His resolve wavered once. His lawyers raised the possibility that he might donate a kidney to his sister, who was ill. He paused on that. The 2 of them turned out not to be a match, and he reaffirmed his decision. Jeffrey Motz was executed at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia on the 6th of May 2011 and pronounced dead at 17 minutes past 6 in the evening. He was 36 years old, 1 day past his birthday. He was the first inmate in the state put to death using a new pentobarbital combination, adopted after the previous drug supply became unavailable. As of 2026, Motz is the reason South Carolina's death chamber sat idle for over a decade. He remained the last person executed in the state until 2024, when the executions resumed. Motts and Martin were housed together despite every reason not to be. In the same state, at the same prison, that same decision would be made again. William Edward Tillman. The South Carolina Department of Corrections sent a man to prison in 1999, and over the next 20 years, it put 2 more men in a cell with him. Neither of them survived it. In April 2024, rather than explain the second one in front of a jury, the state agreed to write a check. William Edward Tillman was born around 1965. He met Harry Jolly Jr. while hitchhiking, and Jolly offered him somewhere to stay. Jolly was 53. The 2 men lived together in Spartanburg County and had a relationship that Tillman later said he had tried to end. Tillman stabbed him in the neck with a butcher knife and testified at trial that he had been defending himself. Prosecutors said he attacked first, and the jury agreed. He received a life sentence and entered the state prison system in 2000. 2 years later, at McCormick Correctional Institution, he ended the life of his cellmate. Michael Hodge was 37 and was serving 10 years on burglary, forgery, and larceny charges. Irvin May, who prosecuted that case, told the Associated Press that the killing was brutal and that Tillman did not mind talking about it. May also drew a line between the 2 cases, describing both as angry encounters over advances that were made and rejected. Tillman pleaded guilty and had 30 years added to a sentence he was never going to finish anyway. As May put it, there is not much you can do to a man already serving life. Tillman went straight to the maximum security isolation unit at Kirkland Correctional Institution and stayed there roughly 13 years, leaving only for court dates and medical care. In 2015, he was returned to a general prison. Department spokeswoman Christy Sheehan said he had met all the criteria needed to go back. Between the 2002 killing and 2019, his entire disciplinary record consisted of 3 violations for having a cell phone and 1 for drugs. That record is the uncomfortable heart of this case, because on paper, the classification decision was defensible. Long-term isolation is expensive and under constant legal pressure, and no system can hold everyone in it forever. Agencies use behavior over time as the measure of who can be moved down, because there is no better measure available. Tillman gave them 13 years of it, and the criteria produced the answer they were designed to produce. If a man's record is essentially clean for 17 years, at what point is a system entitled to treat him as a different man than the one it locked away? On the 29th of April, 2019, at Perry Correctional Institution near Pelzer, Tillman and his cellmate argued. Carl Andrew Paulin Jr. was 45. He was serving a life sentence of his own for beating and stabbing a Myrtle Beach motel owner who had employed him in 1999. According to the arrest warrant, Tillman kicked him in the head several times and then strangled him with a bedsheet. His mother outlived him, and she is the reason any of this reached a courtroom twice. The pattern Irvin May described spans more than 20 years and 3 deaths, and it does not vary much. In each case, the other man was someone Tillman was living with, in a room neither of them could leave. In each case, the violence followed an argument rather than a plan. And in each case, the setting was one the state had chosen for him. Prosecutors have noted that he has never been reluctant to discuss what he did, which is its own kind of information about the man the classification system evaluated in 2015. Tillman pleaded guilty to Paulin's murder in February 2024. It was his 3rd murder conviction and his 2nd inside a prison, and it brought him a 2nd life sentence. He had already been moved in 2022 to Broad River Secure Facility, one of the most restrictive prisons the state operates. The civil case is where the institution had to answer. Attorneys for Paulin's mother alleged a long history of overcrowding at Perry and a failure to provide adequate security, and argued that there were not enough officers on duty, leaving the wing where the two men were housed unattended when it happened. In its response, the department admitted the overcrowding. It admitted that some inmates had access to weapons such as shanks. It admitted that the officer assigned to the wing could not see what was happening. On the 18th of April, 2024, the department agreed to pay $300,000 to Carl Pollin's mother in exchange for the lawsuit being dismissed. South Carolina's prisons have been short-staffed for years, and at the worst point, the system was running roughly 900 officers below strength, about a third of its frontline workforce. As of 2026, William Tillman is in his early 60s, held at Broad River, serving 2 life sentences plus 30 years, and he is not eligible for parole. Tillman never left the state that convicted him. The next man was moved across the country, and the moving is the story. Craig Bjork. There is a program that allows state prison systems to trade inmates with one another. It exists so that a prisoner who has become unmanageable in one state can be absorbed somewhere else and start over. In January 2013, Minnesota used it to send a man to Oregon. Oregon put him in a 2-man cell. Craig Dennis Bjork, who at the time went by the name Craig Jackson, was born around 1959 and grew up in Minneapolis. In 1982, 4 people were harmed fatally inside the apartment where he lived. 2 of them were adults, his girlfriend Ramona Yurkew and a woman named Gwendolyn Johnson. The other 2 were his own young sons. Minneapolis police called it the worst case the city had seen in the 20th century, and the phrasing was not casual. His defense attorney argued that Bjork was so detached from reality that he could not understand what he had done, and cast him as a man with a severe personality disorder who had lost an internal battle. The judge rejected the insanity plea and imposed 3 consecutive life sentences. Ramona Yurkew's father, Dave Yurkew, said something afterward that reads now like a prediction. He said Bjork could kill again, and that there was nothing that was going to stop him from killing again. In the mid-1990s, Bjork wrote to the warden at the Minnesota Correctional Facility at Stillwater, asking to be transferred back to a facility he had been held in before. He put it in writing that if the request was refused, he would take someone's life. The warden declined the request. On Thanksgiving Day, 1997, in a basement kitchen area at Stillwater, Bjork used a plumber's pipe to fatally harm an inmate named Edwin Curry. Curry was 41 and was due to be released the following year. Bjork told guards afterward that he had planned to go after several more men if he had been given the time. He received another life sentence in 1999. Curry's family sued the Minnesota Department of Corrections, arguing that the state had allowed a man it knew to be dangerous, a man who had threatened exactly this, to work alone alongside another inmate. The Eighth Circuit ruled against them in 2000. That ruling matters beyond the family that lost it. The interstate compact exists because every state occasionally holds a prisoner it cannot manage, and moving that prisoner into a system with different facilities and different staff is sometimes the safest available option. What the compact does not transfer is institutional memory. Minnesota knew about the letter to the warden, the pipe in the basement kitchen, and what Bjork had said to guards afterward about the men he intended to reach next. Whether all of that arrived intact in Salem has never been answered publicly, and Oregon corrections officials declined to explain why he was placed in a shared cell. What did Oregon actually know about the man Minnesota was handing over? Bjork arrived at the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem in January 2013 and was placed in general population with a cellmate. On the 17th of August that year, that cellmate was found dead. Joseph Akins was 45 and was serving a life sentence for the abduction and death of a woman taken from a parking lot outside Portland in 1994. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide by strangulation. Suspicion landed on Bjork immediately, and he was placed in segregation. Marion County prosecutors sought the death penalty. That created an unusual situation because Minnesota abolished capital punishment in 1911, and a Minnesota prisoner exported under an interstate compact was now facing execution in another state for something he did after the transfer. Bjork claimed self-defense, cycled through attorneys, obtained a new judge, and at one hearing shouted at his own lawyer in open court. Then the law changed underneath the case. Oregon narrowed the definition of aggravated murder, and Bjork was no longer eligible for a death sentence. He was convicted of his 6th killing and received his 5th life sentence. Marion County Deputy District Attorney Matt Kemme said afterward that the death penalty is supposed to be for the worst of the worst, and that Bjork is absolutely that. The judge asked Minnesota to take him back. Corrections officials in both states negotiated the handoff, and Minnesota did not publicly commit to whether he would be housed there or shipped somewhere else again. 6 people have died at his hands across 3 states and 4 decades. 4 of them died before he entered a prison, and 2 of them died after, in facilities specifically responsible for preventing exactly that. As of the most recent available reporting, Bjork is in his mid-60s, held in segregation, and serving 5 life sentences for 6 killings. Where exactly he is held is not something either department has been willing to discuss in detail. Bjork needed a cell to do what he did. The last man on this list needed only a moving bus, Casey Pidge. On the 1st of February, 2017, an Ohio prison bus was running a loop out of Lucasville with 15 inmates aboard and corrections officers seated at the front. One of the passengers did not survive the trip. It took the Ohio State Highway Patrol roughly 2 hours to work out that anything had happened at all. Casey Pidge was born in 1988 in the Chillicothe area, into a background his own records describe as troubled and neglected. He was later assessed as having an intellectual disability significant enough to place him outside death penalty eligibility, which becomes important later. In September 2008, Peeg went to the home of Rhonda Summers, the mother of his former girlfriend, and cut her throat with a box cutter. He stayed and watched her die. Then he set the house on fire. In November 2009, he pleaded guilty to aggravated murder, robbery, arson, and other charges, and received a sentence reported as 30 years to life. He gave himself a nickname taken from the tool he had used. In February 2016, at Lebanon Correctional Institution, he had been celled with Luther Wade for 1 single day. Wade was 26. Pig had convinced himself that Wade was an Aryan Brotherhood member sent to harm him. He talked Wade into wearing a blindfold as part of a card trick, then used a cinder block he had pried out of the cell wall. Investigators looking at the facility afterward found a hole between supposedly high-security cells, large enough for Pig to have squeezed through to play cards with another inmate. A prison social worker who interviewed him after that killing wrote a line that should have ended every housing debate about him. Pig denied wanting to be a serial killer, the note said, but could not promise that he would not do it again. On the 30th of January, 2017, he pleaded guilty to Wade's murder and received life without parole. 2 days later, he was on the bus. He sat in the very back, behind the other inmates and out of the officer's line of sight. He was in handcuffs, leg irons, and a belly chain. He worked the belly chain free and used it on David Johnson, who was serving 8 years for sexual battery. Officers assumed Johnson had fallen asleep. Afterward, Pidge told the other men on the bus that he guessed they had never seen that on a bus before. How does a man in 3 separate sets of restraints get close enough to anyone on a vehicle staffed by corrections officers? The response afterward shows how thin the margin was. Troopers stopped the bus, but did not immediately identify what had happened. By the time the patrol concluded it was investigating a homicide, roughly 2 hours had passed. Pig had already been moved onto a second bus, and that vehicle had to be pulled over separately, so investigators could take his clothing and restraint chains as evidence. For part of that afternoon, the man responsible was in motion through the Ohio prison system, with other inmates, while nobody transporting him knew what he had just done. He pleaded guilty in Pickaway County and received 25 years to life, a sentence that changes nothing about when he gets out, because he is never getting out. Prosecutor Judy Wolford made a point of saying that whether or not the man who died was incarcerated, he was still a human being, and there was still a victim in the case. One of the inmates who had been on the bus wrote to the state prisons director afterward, saying staff had not been doing their job monitoring the passengers, even with a man like that among them. Ohio overhauled its transport policy after that. The state began replacing its vans with vehicles fitted with cameras and individual secure compartments, which is a fairly direct admission of what the old ones allowed. It was not the last incident. In February 2018, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, Pidge and another inmate named Greg Reinke attacked corrections officer Matthew Mathias with a metal shank, stabbing him more than 30 times. Mathias suffered a collapsed lung and survived. Pidge pleaded guilty and had 32 years added to his sentence. Reinke received 86. As of 2026, Casey Pidge is 38 years old and held at the Ohio State Penitentiary, the state's supermax facility near Youngstown, serving life without parole plus several additional decades. 3 people have lost their lives at his hands, and 2 of those 3 died after the state of Ohio had already taken custody of him. Every one of these men is accounted for tonight, in a cell, in a case file, in a settlement paid out of a state budget. The systems holding them keep adjusting after the fact, and the adjustments keep arriving late. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.